Well, hello and welcome to the final discussion in the current GOMA Talks series. Before we get underway, I'd just like to recognise the traditional owners of the land upon which we're gathering tonight, past and present. I'm Antony Funnell from RN, Radio National, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight to chair this session. As you know, this exhibition, that this series of talks is wedded to is called My Country, I Still Call Australia Home, Contemporary Art from Black Australia. And in today's session, titled History, we'll be exploring how contemporary artists are capturing past histories, expressing current ideas and issues, and shaping possible futures. So, without further ado, let me introduce our guests for this evening. They are Bindi Cole, and Bindi's a contemporary artist who lives in Melbourne and produces photographic pieces and installations. Bindi has several works in the My Country exhibition, including the piece I Forgive You 2012, which was created in response to the 2008 apology to the Stolen Generation. Ian McLean is a research professor of contemporary art at the University of Wollongong. He was one of the first people to write about the place of Indigenous art in contemporary Australian art theory and practice, and his publications include the 2011 anthology How Aborigines Invented the Idea of Contemporary Art. Our third guest is Glenn Isiger Pilkington, and Glenn is an Associate Curator of Indigenous Objects and Photography at the Art Gallery of Western Australia, and he's also been the recipient of a Wesfarmers Arts Indigenous Fellowship with the National Gallery. And finally, composer and musician William Barton, and William specialises in the didgeridoo. In 2008, William was one of 3 Australian composers for the Beijing Olympics opening ceremony, and in 2012 he won a prestigious ARIA award for the category Best Classical Album. So join me in giving them a round of applause. Now, people are joining us tonight via webcam, and so welcome to all of you who've joined us that way. And if you want to have your say in the audience, or if you're sitting out there at home, remember that you can tweet us a question using the hashtag #GOMA Talks, all one word, or simply SMS 048888 Talks. That's #GOMA Talks or SMS 048888 Talks. Glenn, I might open up with you. Art can sometimes simply be about experimenting with form or with a type of medium. But it's quite apparent when you look at the great majority of the art pieces in the My Country exhibition that they're also informed by historical themes. Is that true of much of contemporary Indigenous art in Australia?
Look, I think as with any art from any country or peoples, it's a very diverse platform in which for people to share their stories. And I think what's particularly interesting with Indigenous Australian art is that for a long time in this country, people weren't able to have a voice or tell their stories. So there's a real prevalence of narrative within the works that you see in this exhibition that we're here to talk about, but also, I guess, more broadly across the whole country in exhibitions. That's not to say that there aren't artists working in materiality and different conceptual understandings of art, and trying to talk about the world we live in different ways. But I think narrative through art has been a really wonderful tool for people to talk about very difficult things, and that's really seen in this exhibition.
And to reconnect with the histories, with the stories of their community, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think, Indigenous people have been shifted around and displaced and dispossessed, and so there's been a lot of reconnecting that has happened over the last 50 or 60 years. For some people, they've had their traditional story and language, and there hasn't been any kind of intervention in that. But for others, there's been a need to kind of culturally reinvent and I guess reconnect with story and place through their work.
Bindi, there's several different points of history at play in your installation, I Forgive You, which is featured in the My Country exhibition. There's the recent history of 2008 and Kevin Rudd's apology then as Prime Minister. But the emu feathers that you've used to make up those 3 simple words, I forgive you, they're emblematic, aren't they, of a much more distant history?
They are, and they're really personal to me too. I was completely inspired to use emu feathers after I had an opportunity to visit the National Gallery of Australia or the National Museum of Australia, and I went up there and I saw some artefacts made by my direct ancestors, and they were these absolutely beautiful emu feather skirts and other types of objects. And as soon as I saw those, I just had to make something out of emu feathers. And they're really beautiful and unique. I mean, they're the only feather in the world that's a double feather, kind of starts at the top and comes down like this. And emus themselves are just gorgeous creatures, very fiercely protective of their young and stubborn, strong animals too.
So story's important, but using objects that are associated with Aboriginality, that's important as well, is it, in your work?
At times it's important. It's not something that I would say that I completely adhere to or feel like I have to. I can hear my earrings clinking around. It's distracting me. I'm going to take them off. Oh, that's better.
That's much better.
Yeah, I'm trying to talk and listen to them.
So it's not always there?
No, it's not always there for me. Definitely not. I think as an artist, I just want to use whatever I can, whatever comes to mind, whatever is potent and important to me at the time when I'm making art. And with the narrative stuff, for me, it's all about having a voice. So whatever gives voice in the best way possible. And at times I just fall in love with things too. I fell in love with emu feathers. I'm in love with clouds and things at the moment. I become obsessed with things. I get obsessed with teeth and all sorts of crazy things. So,
and in your personal work, that voice it's your personal voice. Is it also a voice for your community or your family, say?
I think first and foremost it's a very personal voice for me. Even the I Forgive You work, I get that it is a response to the apology, but that wasn't why I made it. I made it because of the power that forgiveness had played in my own life in overcoming trauma and the manifestation of trauma. And so I wanted to kind of bring that out as something to focus on and look on as an alternative to other options that may be presented to communities around healing. And then, of course, it has a much broader context in that it is directly speaking to that apology, but it wasn't my first reason for making it.
Ian McLean, bringing you into the discussion. You're an historian of arts. Is it possible to identify when we started to see Indigenous art not only being used as a vehicle for the telling of traditional historic tales, but also, if you like, as a sort of tool for shaping or indeed attempting to correct our understanding of Australian history?
It's a difficult question because historians, we start going back and back and back, you know, and you keep finding precedents. So it's very difficult to think of any Aboriginal art made since colonialism, which is not in some way reflecting upon the new historical circumstance that colonialism is.
So even the more traditional forms of Indigenous art that we would recognise?
Well, historians will find history anywhere. So, if you take some of the earliest bark paintings, in fact, the earliest, I think the earliest bark painting is from Victoria, from around the 1850s, and it depicts squatters and other colonial life there. But perhaps if you take some of the earliest bark paintings collected up in Arnhem Land, which anthropologists asked the local people to copy the rock paintings, you can quite easily, I think, start to read those paintings in terms of that particular moment when anthropologists come in.
And in the last couple of decades, have we seen a change, particularly with what I guess we could look at an exhibition like My Country and say that you could break it up into two lots. There's the remote art that's inspired by traditional techniques, if you like, and then there's what's often called the urban Indigenous art, which is much more abstract. Did the rise of that urban Indigenous art, did that change the way in which history was employed by artists?
remote art is always about history. It's always about ancestral stories, and the reason those early Papunya boards were made was to tell their stories, their histories. So I would suspect, if anything, it was perhaps the other way around, that these histories being told by people in the remote centres sort of inspired people in the urban areas to start to tell their stories. Just if you look at it, historically, but but even early, like, well, no, I won't say any more.
Mm-hmm.
But that early bark painting I mentioned, I suppose it was made on the Murray River, on the frontier. So perhaps we would think of it as a remote work at the time. But I suppose now we tend to think of that work that was made in Victoria back then by McRae and William Barrack, and that we tend to sort of categorise it more in the non-traditional category.
Mm-hmm. William Barton, with the music that you compose and perform, you've managed to pull together two historic traditions. I know you're interested in jazz and rock as well, but you're probably most known for the didgeridoo and a fusion with classical music. So one of those traditions is Indigenous, one of them is classical European. What's the connection? What connects those two essential aspects of your music, your work?
I guess what connects those two, world apart, basically, simplest way to put it is that the music is a language, it's a speaking language, and it's a universal language, as is quite often repeated in history, and that's what brings people together. And I was very fortunate with the upbringing that I had in Mount Isa. We had the traditional side, which I learnt from my uncle, my father, my mother, and my mother, who's in the audience today. She used to play classical music to me before I was born, like Mario Lanza and the Great Caruso and Bach and Vivaldi and all that sort of stuff. And so it was in my subconscious psyche, to, I guess, eventually find through the mist of the desert shores this music that I heard in my subconscious mind as a baby, I guess. And, listening to my AC/DC, my Led Zeppelin and all the other fun stuff that goes with it, I found a great comfort in listening to, or connection listening to classical music, and particularly like European classical music. Because if you think about it, the composers of those times were writing about their landscape, were writing about about nationalism and about country and about the four seasons like Vivaldi did. And so, in my innocence as a kid, as a young teenager, these are just elements that have organically developed in my mind, and I've been very fortunate to be able to collaborate across the palette of music and tones and sounds, and how that relates back to the landscape through the didgeridoo, being a branch of a tree eaten out by termites or the white ants, and having this raw piece of wood, this piece of branch that turns into a musical instrument, and you not only connect to yourself through that instrument to Mother Earth, but to the people listening.
And then connecting that to European classical music, and particularly, I suppose, 18th century classical music was very much inspired by natural settings, wasn't it? Almost as a rejection against industrialisation. Landscape, then, is it a conscious thing? Is it there as you're sitting down to compose a piece? Are you thinking about landscape deliberately to inspire yourself? Or does that sense of country just naturally come through in what you're doing?
It is naturally always there. It's like your signature, your technique as a composer or a musician, as an improviser of visual arts or music. It is always there in your subconscious. So you don't have to force it, but you can, if you're not getting any inspiration for that moment in time, you might have a commission that you have to finish, and sometimes you mightn't, start it until the 12th hour sort of thing, and got 8 hours to finish it sort of thing. 20-minute orchestra work, as I've done, and finished it. But it's about...
So it's a tool in that sense then?
Yeah,
It
it's
can
a
be
tool. It's a tool where you can, you know, bring it out into the world when you need to, and just be gentle with it, because it's, you know, a gift that has been given to you, know, through the land.
Bindi, as the other artist on this panel, what does landscape mean to you? Is landscape important as well? That sense of country?
Yeah, landscape is important, and the sense of country is important too. Knowing where I come from, knowing where I belong, particularly to my family, country is really important. Every time I make art, whatever I'm making, I always show it to my family. I make sure they're okay with it, that they're happy with what I'm doing. I don't know if landscape informs my work as much. I think I'm making art that's more about identity than about country, even though that is definitely tied up within it. It's more about reconciling identity and possibly the politics of it.
Glenn, looking at, as a curator, looking at the art that you deal with, I mean, that notion, I guess, of going back to country is often spoken about when we talk about Indigenous peoples and the way they relate to the land. Is that then, in a sense, is it important? Does art perform almost a spiritual task in reconnecting people to land?
Is it important to have your country on your passport? You know, it's a similar thing. Of course it's important. Where you come from, you know, especially for Aboriginal people, isn't just a town or a name. It's a place and a kind of whole lot of understandings of yourself and your society and the laws that govern who you are and who you marry. So definitely, and I think country and a need to assert and a connection to country is very important for Aboriginal people, because it allows us to not only identify ourselves but to identify each other, and to greet each other on country and to welcome people to country. But obviously from around Australia you've got, you know, hundreds of different language groups, and I think this exhibition really asserts that idea of cultural independence and diversity, and I think that's a really important thing to understand, is that we're not one Indigenous people. We're many multiples of different clan groups and language groups, and with that comes different understandings of the world around us, and different ways of depicting that and sharing that with the world, as you see in this exhibition.
So is in that sense then, it's a way, art can be a way of connecting someone. I suppose the majority of Indigenous people in Australia now live in cities. They don't live perhaps on their traditional land. It's a way of connecting them, but is it also a way of helping other Indigenous people understand the greater connectivity of Indigenous culture?
Look, I think it's really important for, firstly, the term urban-based artist is a funny thing for me. It kind of denies people's histories. Like, I really think that, yes, a lot of Aboriginal people are living in cities, but a lot of them have histories that go back to country and go back to remote and regional parts of Australia. But I think that, in a way, the assertion of your own culture is the important part of what you're seeing. And it's really beautiful when you bring Aboriginal people from different parts of the country together to see the response they have to each other's work. I think that's a really interesting thing that in Western Australia I've seen feed into people's practices, which has been quite beautiful. And I think, you know, in some cases what happened in Papunya in the 70s went on to be something which was mimicked around the whole country, and it still is to this day. So, you know, there is a tendency for people to borrow kind of patterns and visual languages and so on.
It was enormously successful, wasn't it, as well?
Well, yeah, it was hugely successful. And I think to this day you can walk into, I don't know, in the mall here in Queensland and buy a terrible dot painting that may or may not have been done by an Aboriginal person. But once that style had become a commercially viable thing, it kind of spread like wildfire. And you can't deny an Aboriginal person the right to make money from, you know, their culture and their understanding of themselves. And because of the huge intervention in a lot of Aboriginal people's language and law and custom, you know, a lot of Aboriginal people adopted something that they thought was familiar and a sense of their own identity with that. But that's another debate altogether,
I guess given all the change that's gone on in society for Indigenous people over the last 100, 200 years, a lot of people would have lost contact with what was their traditional way of painting or expressing themselves.
Definitely. Like the only Indigenous custom that I have has been told in English for 4 generations. So, my grandmother knows a little language, my father a little language, my great-grandmother knew language quite well, Yamaji languages or Wodjiri language. But for me, all of my understanding of who I am has been taught in English and other languages, European languages, which I think is another thing. I'm made up of lots of different things, and so my understanding of myself, unfortunately, is quite connected to quite a lot of colonisers.
Mm-hmm. Ian, your thoughts on this?
On exactly what when you say this?
There was a lot in that, wasn't there? I mean, I guess on the way in which art can be used as a connection to your own history, but also connecting different Indigenous peoples across the country to each other.
Well, art has always been, and by art I mean music, ceremonies, festivals. Art has always been used to bring people together, whether it's in Olympic Games beginning with art events. That's sort of what art does. It's something that brings people together because art was originally a collective experience. I suppose we tend to today think of art as things that individuals do, but that's a very recent history. So I think art is always something. What William said about music being a sort of a universal language. I think that's true of all the arts.
Mm-hmm.
So, when politicians from different countries meet, they often give a gift that's some sort of art, because it's the way we tell other people who we are.
William, your use of the didgeridoo, is that a connection in a way? Do you see it almost as a bridge between cultures for people? Is it a way that people can access Indigenous art in a way that feels familiar to them or more familiar to them?
Even if it's unfamiliar to the international crowds, it's something that tells a story from the Australian landscape, or from me when I'm playing. That's what I try to do, is I try to project I guess a thought of community music and community sort of connection to whether I'm playing in the USA or Asia or Europe. And I connect because it's, I guess, a branch of a tree, and it's a very simple thing that the person is seeing. So it's just like you are connecting your one with this like this message stick, and I think it's like a message stick that can easily be adapted to different musical styles. That's why we go back to the musical universal language. I was in Egypt a few years ago for the 60th anniversary of bilateral relations, and I couldn't speak a word of lingo, Egyptian, to the crew there who I was performing with, and they couldn't speak English to me, but we spoke through our music, and we put together this quite complicated 20-minute work, with Kevin Rudd and all the crew were there, and so I mean.
Now, we use the term Indigenous, we tag, it's a tag in a sense, isn't it? And it can be useful. Is it sometimes limiting, though, for you with your art?
I'm proud to say that, when people ask me, what do I do? I say, I'm a didgeridoo player, I'm a composer. And certainly, it didn't happen overnight where people in our circles sort of, know William Barton in the classical environment. But, it takes time to allow for, I guess, an organic education, an organic process for people to appreciate the didgeridoo. My biggest issue with, not issue, but I guess speed hump in the world with the classical world was to basically prove that the didgeridoo was not just a droning instrument, and that, yeah, you can put any didgeridoo player with a symphony orchestra just to tick the box to say, yes, we've got a ethnic instrument in this sophisticated classical world. But it's more to it than that. For me, it was about the sophistication of the didgeridoo as a soloistic instrument on its own, in its own language, drawing upon all the experience of the landscape that I experienced as a kid growing up in Mount Isa in Kalkadunga country.
And am I right in saying you actually, as a composer, the didgeridoo, you incorporate that in. That's there in the score as well. It's not just an accompaniment to the other music that you write. It's written in, which is unusual, isn't it, with didgeridoo playing?
It's an integral part of the orchestral piece. So even though I'm quite comfortable improvising, every time I perform a piece, it becomes structured, kind of like a jazz piece, where you can do your bag of tricks here and there. Yeah.
Somebody's tweeted to say, great to hear William Barton highlight the commonalities of cultures as expressed through music rather than political divisions. Somebody also has a question, is music really a universal language?
Well, yes, because here I am a kid listening to, AC/DC or Led Zeppelin as a kid. And those sounds, when you first hear them, they're actually unfamiliar, an unfamiliar language. You don't know what they're singing about, but you like the sound of it. And so that's what draws you in the first place. If you're out in the middle of the desert, are you going to be going towards a sound that sounds like a ghost or the sound of drums and rock and roll? I think I'm going to be going to the rock and roll.
Bindi, the term Indigenous, being labelled in a sense as an Indigenous artist, for somebody like yourself, what are the pros and cons?
Well, I guess the con is that sometimes you'd just like to be an artist and not have any labels. If I'm not labelled as an Indigenous artist, I'm labelled as a female artist or a feminist artist, and so at times that can be it can feel a little bit like you have to be one of these things. You can't just be an artist. But on the flip side, I'm so proud of who I am and my heritage and my family and where I come from that I don't mind being labelled an Indigenous artist too. And I'm really proud to be in a show such as this where I'm alongside so many great artists who I look up to and have looked up to for many, many years. So I guess, it's a bit of both.
Glenn, your thoughts?
Look, it is what it is. I think we live in a world where labels help people understand who you are, even if they're sort of forced upon you. We all live under these kind of banners. I think it can be difficult for some people who perhaps are Aboriginal people who trained as artists, not as Aboriginal artists. I went to art school and I had no intention of firstly ever being a curator. Secondly, I didn't want to be branded as an Indigenous curator. So for me, I find it difficult when I read Indigenous curator, because it's actually, I'm a curator of Indigenous art.
It's almost like you're being excluded, is it? Like you're being made to be other, even though you are part of that grouping.
Yeah. So it's all semantics. Back to that idea of, is music a kind of a universal language? I think it's about the way we see and understand the world, and fair enough, if you're listening to something in French and you don't speak French, you don't understand what's being said, but you can still hear something, And I think for me, I've always been proud to be everything that I am, all of those labels. So, I'm proud to have a Dutch grandfather and an Aboriginal grandfather and kind of,
And a related issue, talk to us about positioning within a gallery or an exhibition, because that's also important, isn't it, for dealing with the sense of whether you're part of the community or whether you're, yes, part of the community, but you're also still other.
Oh, that's a bit tricky. Look, I think within every institution or art institution, you are the other, and if there's any inquiry about Aboriginal art or culture, or really bizarre questions about where can I find Indigenous plants and stuff like that we get at the gallery. You're the first port of call, and people often are so kind of afraid of having a go at answering something that they will come to you first. And so you are the other, and at school I was the other. I was kind of the white Aborigine, and I grew up in the Kimberleys, so it was a very different experience. But being that other never meant that I wasn't included into those communities that I grew up in. So I think being the other is also a perception of the person who is the other and how you frame that yourself and what response you have to being the other. There's a lot of power that can come from it as well.
Sure, but I mean, in terms of the positioning within a gallery, we often, or we have in the past, haven't we? We've seen where, a gallery has, or an exhibition has accepted Indigenous art, but then almost quarantined it as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think I guess it's been referred to as ghettoising a lot of the time, and I think you can make things the other by having them sit out of a conversation with the rest of material culture that's been produced around the world. But it can be done in a way to really sort of pay homage to ancestors and those past as well. So I think, from my point of view, my colleague in AGWA in Perth, we came at it from a different point of view in regards to our recent decision to put Indigenous art within our collections side by side with international art and with Australian art. So in that way, we offered people that opportunity to see the kind of nuance and difference between what an Australian non-Indigenous artist was making in 1979 versus what an Indigenous artist. And in that is a kind of really dynamic story that can be fleshed out. But at the same time, we do offer more of an immersive experience where people can go and look solely at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art, because that has a different role. And I think that role is about educating and informing and paying respect. And so I think the way we present art has different roles, and a collection display is very different than, say, what's happening in my country.
Ian, that issue of quarantining, that's particularly an issue, or it has been an issue at the moment in the last couple of weeks with the big Australian art exhibition in the UK, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think where the badge Indigenous art really falls down is when you go overseas, because when you go overseas, especially in Europe, and you talk to the contemporary art world there and curators there, as soon as you say Indigenous art, they immediately sort of box it into some sort of anthropological category. I think it's a great pity that the Royal Academy show has put all the Indigenous art in one room. And I've been reading the reviews of the exhibition, and quite a few reviewers, there's a common theme that the contemporary Australian art section, sort of 1980 onwards, is a dismal failure, but the Aboriginal art's really good. And no one seems to have connected that all that art in the Aboriginal art room has all been made, or not all of it, but the great majority of it has been made is contemporary art. And if they put it in with the contemporary art, the contemporary art room, would have looked a lot stronger, I think.
And by putting it in, by viewing it in an anthropological way, that way, in some senses you're devaluing the work of the artist, aren't you? As compared to these other great works of art that there are alongside it that aren't pigeonholed.
Yeah, I'm not saying the Royal Academy put it in an anthropological context. It's just that's how a lot of European curators, they just can't accept that Indigenous art can be in a contemporary art context. In the Royal Academy, it's still in the Royal Academy after all. It's Indigenous art.
Sorry.
No,
you go. I think if you look at what the National Gallery have achieved in the new Stage 1 development in Canberra, that's a different thing in the way that you're offering people a really comprehensive experience with Aboriginal art. But I think it is an interesting decision to not place, uniquely Australian works. They're more Australian than anything else in that exhibition, yet they're put in their own little room, in their own little place, and there's no connection between those works being made by Aboriginal people in the modern era with the other works that are by people coexisting on this continent. So I think that choice to kind of actively segregate, perhaps talks about a few institutional approaches, but from the scathing reviews that I've read, it's not
only
particularly
segregates
good.
it from international and other Australian art. It's actually segregated Indigenous art from other Indigenous art. And so you don't get this sort of conversation. It is actually quite anthropological, I think, in the way the National Gallery has it. And perhaps the room that comes off worst is actually the room that says urban Indigenous art.
Yeah. Well, is there, just picking up on that, I mean, is there a tendency by some to view what we've referred to as remote contemporary art from remote communities as not being contemporary art? We can, if we look at, say, a piece of, I know you don't like the term, but urban Indigenous art, it's very clearly, a lot of it's abstract, it's very clearly contemporary. Is that always the case, though, with the remote contemporary arts?
Well, I think remote contemporary artists have had a much harder time trying to get into biennales and documenters and things like that overseas than have the urban artists. And the recent documenter, I think, is the first time that a remote artist has got into that.
And why is that?
Well, because I think there is still this very strong European idea that Indigenous art is primitive art and that it belongs in an anthropological context. And and the only reason that I really got into the last documentary is because the person who curated that had curated the Sydney Biennale previously, and was aware of what was happening in Australia.
Bindi, your thoughts on this?
Look, I don't think that I'm a curator and know all of the kind of answers to all of this stuff. The thing I find interesting personally is that in the art world, I'm always an Indigenous artist. My work is always in Indigenous shows, it's collected for Indigenous collections. But then if you look in the broader media, I'm constantly having to authenticate my Aboriginality. I'm not black enough. So in one sense, I'm black, but in the other sense, I'm not black enough. And so in a personal way, this narrative really affects me, I suppose, about where I sit and where my art is placed. And I had to end up in federal court defending my position and defending the fact that I'd made work of my own volition and through my own credit, as opposed to just jumping on an Aboriginal bandwagon. So I guess this stuff affects me in a very personal way rather than a broader institutional way.
Glenn?
I think this notion of urban Indigenous art is just a kind of catchphrase that has caught on and hasn't been looked at for long enough. I think, by calling someone an urban artist, you deny the fact that the country that the cities are built on was something else before. And I think that's for me, it's like, a lot of people working in cities actually have histories that link to country, which are long histories. And so I think, I always say, metropolitan-based artists, because I think that is a little bit more honest and kind of respectful of what this country was before we decided to build on it.
But I mean, the question still is then, again, it still applies if you use that term, doesn't it? Is that seen, is metropolitan-based art, is that seen as more...
Well, it means that somebody has a
history
history beyond living in that city. I think place does, have a part to do with our identity, but I just think that, there are other connotations to do with urban artists, and it is more, there's still Aboriginal people talking about, themselves, their family, their country, the politics which impact their lives, or perhaps not talking about anything which is particularly Indigenous but is in fact more human.
William, as a musician, are these issues for you? I mean, you seem to have skirted around being quarantined, don't you? I mean, you as I mentioned before, you do jazz, you do rock, you do traditional Aboriginal music, and you combine classical music with that as well.
Now, I guess, backtracking, we've all, I guess, made a conscious effort to put in the time to prove ourselves, our ability, and not be limited by any limitations, even those imposed on us by others. And that's sometimes what the label of Indigenous or Aboriginal may present to us at times. But I was just looking at one of the comments here from the Twitter world. to all the guests, how much of the work, readdresses the past and the history, putting things straight. Well, the piece that I co-wrote with a non-Indigenous composer, Matthew Heinsohn, about 5 years ago, we premiered it at the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, and we wrote it based on a song I wrote when I was 15 years old. It was about the passing of the culture from one generation to the next. And there's one of many reasons that I work in the classical realm, and one of those strong reasons is because I know that most of the people that attend concert halls, not only in Australia, but the concert halls around the world, in that wonderful world of the concert goers, they would probably in their lifetime, find that they've never met an Aboriginal person before, or they've just read about, the negativity in the pages, And so I saw that as a young kid. This is going back from when I was a young kid. I wanted to really change that around to say, okay, I'm Aboriginal, but I can be in the same box, as the same category as a classical violinist, as a soloist. And this is where it comes where the label thing of Indigenous, whether you're paid the same. So I've found that a lot, the old thing of, we're an organisation, we haven't got much money and blah, blah, blah. You can only listen to that about 500,000 times in your lifetime before you start saying, I think I need a pay rise now.
Right.
So they're all things that you balance over your life, as in any profession. Mm-hmm. And you just got to live and breathe your culture, your identity, and that's you as a visual artist or a musician or whatever.
And this is GOMA Talks here at the Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane. I'm Antony Funnell, and today's discussion is entitled History: How Contemporary Artists Are Capturing Past Histories, Expressing Current Ideas and Issues, and Shaping Possible Futures. And our panellists are curator and artist Glenn Isiger-Pilkington, musician and 2012 ARIA Award winner William Barton, artist Bindi Cole, whose work is featured in the My Country exhibition, and art historian Ian McLean from the University of Wollongong. And don't forget, if you do want to send us a question, use the hashtag #GOMA Talks, all one word. I just want to quickly talk about audience, about the people who come to galleries. How many of the people who come to a gallery or even buy an artwork are actually interested in the story, the history that goes with that particular piece of art? Bindi, perhaps we could start with you. And does that matter to you as an artist?
Yeah, it does matter to me. I think that, personally, all my artwork is about telling a story. I'm not really working to make beautiful objects or pretty things. It's all about having a voice and having a platform for the voice and telling a story. And so when people buy my art or when they look at my art, I think that they are hearing that voice. They're trying to read the story. It becomes subjective to them in many ways, but it's very much about telling that story, and it's really important that story be told and be a part of the work. And I think as people do buy my artwork, they're buying it for the voice that's in it. Because I have made pretty things before and nobody's really interested.
Well, it's reassuring to hear, I suppose.
Yeah.
Glenn, on the big picture though, we do know that Aboriginal art is enormously popular. It finds its way into boardrooms, into government offices. Some would say it's been appropriated in that way.
Mine doesn't.
Are those people though, are they at all interested in what the story is there, or are they just collectors?
I think there's, a bit cynical about some of this stuff. There's a lot of different types of buyers. There are investor buyers, there are people who buy small things and, are really about that kind of understanding and educating themselves. But I think there are also a large percentage of collectors who have purchased Aboriginal art in the past for perhaps maybe not the most authentic reasons or the most sincere reasons. Audiences tend to kind of, I'm just trying to not be super cynical about this.
No, feel free, open up.
Get it out.
Look, I think there's a lot of people who like an authentic black experience, who want the photograph with the artist and want the certificate of authenticity. And, I think there's, for me, a lot of collective guilt in this country because of the history we've experienced, that perhaps people may feel that by buying a painting and buying into a sector or an industry that they're able to kind of put that at ease a little for themselves.
So wipe away some of that collective guilt.
Yeah, perhaps. This
Ian?
is just one of my thoughts.
Your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it'd be difficult to deny that there's not a lot of trying to deal with guilt in terms of the way, especially the large abstract Western desert painting features all the time behind politicians and in banks and on aeroplanes and things like that. I mean, you'd have to be blind not to read it in that way. But I don't think that necessarily means it's a bad thing. Because it is important to deal with the past, and you've got to do one step at a time, and
or one painting at a time,
or one painting at a time. But I know one particular collector I'm thinking of. They sort of started collecting Western desert painting, read about the stories, but now they're collecting more shall we say political in-your-face type work, and that's how it moves. I did find something William said really interesting. I think it's very interesting that perhaps music is more universal than painting. There are just heaps of examples of Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists working together. Indigenous artists can play rock music without being called inauthentic, but with painting, for some reason, or with visual images, we seem to lock people down more into these boxes, and it seems to be much harder for Indigenous and non-Indigenous painters to collaborate without all sorts of difficulties arising. I don't know why that is, but it's...
Because it's one more thing that can be stolen, I guess. For me, a collaboration is only a collaboration if two people go into something willingly.
But why not with music, do you think?
I don't know. I think with music, perhaps... I guess it's... I'm not sure. I'm not the musician,
Yeah,
but
it's just something I thought of when William was talking.
William, do you have any thoughts on that?
Just reiterate the question, please.
That want me to reiterate the question?
Look, if you don't mind, yeah.
Yeah, that musicians seem to be able to work with each other, no matter what culture they're from, much more easily than painters or people dealing with visual images. Somehow music does seem to be a more universal thing.
Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, well, see, when you're an instrumentalist, when you're playing an instrument, you don't have to embody the language of that person as the person behind the technique or playing those notes on the piano or violin or guitar. That's why you can go out in the middle of the bush and, find some old bloke playing Slim Dusty, or Johnny Cash. And if it's voice, you're hearing, I guess, well, this is the way I put it, like, you're hearing, like, the human voice. It's one of the first sounds of the universe. Music, the sound is of language being spoken, and visual arts is a platform that captures a moment in time, especially out in the bush, or anywhere in the world. All those ancient artifacts and engravings, they capture a story of that time. Those stories were most likely lived though, or spoken about orally. So it's help keeping that image there being passed on, and so I guess the techniques. I'm no artist, visual artist, but yeah. Put my fingerprint on that American visa thing when you go.
Ian, I just want to go to a tweet here. A criticism of the Royal Academy, it says, is that it had nationalistic themes. How important is it for contemporary Australian artists to move away from these ideas?
Well, I think contemporary Australian artists moved away from those ideas many years ago. I don't think many Australian artists have been making Australian paintings or paintings about being Australian really since the sort of Sid Nolan and Arthur Boyd generation. Art has really been... Contemporary art is an art form that is not nationalistic, just by definition. It's a much more sort of global thing, and Australian artists have been trying to put themselves into that field since the 70s, which is perhaps why the Royal Academy show starts to fall apart
Glenn, your
after
thoughts?
the 70s.
I think it's hard to have a show about Australia and the landscape, which isn't in many ways nationalistic. We have a very particular continent with a very particular history of sharing that and who we want to be. I think what's more interesting is that perhaps that kind of national identity that we've put out as being a kind of harmonious, integrated kind of continent and nation, then you get to the exhibition in London and find that all the Aboriginal people are in one little room. I think that's more of an interesting thing to
Well, I think landscape painting has been incredibly important to that Australian national identity. And if I was an Indigenous person and I saw those landscape paintings being made, I would have run a mile, because those paintings, they're not paintings of country, they're paintings of mapping out a piece of land that you want to possess. That's what the landscape aesthetic is sort of about. It's a very different aesthetic to the aesthetic that started to develop in contemporary art from the 70s on, which tried to move away from that sort of thing. And the Royal Academy, I haven't seen the Royal Academy show, but I know there are lots of those big landscape type paintings in there, and I think it's very difficult to have an exhibition which is dominated by those sort of paintings to not have nationalistic overtones. The British landscape, picturesque landscape tradition is how Britain sort of thinks of itself as a nation, and Australia does for the same sort of reasons. Landscape has been sort of about that.
Now, we're fast running out of time, but I do want to ask a couple of questions to the panel about the use of humour in artworks. And Bindi, let's start with you, because there's much humour in your work, isn't there?
Yeah,
as a storytelling device.
That's right. Look, I think that oftentimes I'm trying to unearth things that are quite deep and painful and have left scars, whether that's personally or on a broader level. And one way to do that, rather than just go to people, look, here's all this pain and trauma, is to kind of add humour to it. And it's a way of allowing people in, which is a good thing. Also, I think in the Aboriginal community, humour is massive. I mean, it's just a way of communicating. It's a normal kind of way of being. And so it also allows the community in at the same time too. And although I think some of my humour is often quite dark humour, can take a while to get at
Well,
times.
a lot of it in the My Country, there's a lot of humour in the My Country exhibition, and a lot of it is dark, as you say about your own. Glenn, why is there so much humour in there, given that a lot of the subject matter deals with historical incidents that are appalling, that are very dark?
Well, it's actually not funny. No, just getting
Thank you for
look,
that.
I think there's a lot of humour in there, because if you have a history of more than 200 years, which is filled with atrocity and massacre and rape and pillage and death and murder, and that the only way that people were, whilst they were living through these terrible things, to bring light and to have a little bit of life and energy, which isn't about dealing with those things, is to bring humour to it. And I think that artists are now harnessing the power of humour and irony and satire to tell stories in ways that make their work more approachable, as Bindi picked up on. So, Richard Bell's videos, for example, are a great example of that. A lot of particularly conservative white people don't find them that funny.
Mm. But that humour, that's not unusual for peoples who have been oppressed, who faced a history of oppression over time, is it?
Not at all.
Think of, the Jewish people are very famous for their humour.
Yeah, and I think the humour exchanged between Aboriginal people is very different from the humour exchanged between Aboriginal and non-Indigenous people. And so I think that's another element. I've sat with Aboriginal communities in remote Australia and watched a whole lot of humour happening without a word being said. So, I think that's something. Humour is a way of being able to tell stories without kind of putting people through that experience. It allows them to experience it in a way that gives them a break or a breath,
That's good, and it stops you from being a victim to those things as well. You can talk about those things, you can show them, you can be explicit about them, but you're not the victim to it, which is really important.
William, is humour important for you?
Yeah, most definitely. From, working in the education, performing in schools and interacting with university students and such, it's very important. Another universal element of connecting to a person or to anyone, Sometimes I play this thing on the didgeridoo called didgeridoo rap, and it's it's about the little Joey Kangaroo doing the moonwalk, and
I've just got a very nice image in my head. Thank you.
And so that sort of engages with the audience, and I've played that even in a very straight classical concert to as part of my solo, and just made people laugh, and because it's just so, off the planet, it's just, what the hell is he doing?
Now you're doing all these creative things with the didgeridoo, and you're blending it into other music forms, as we've spoken about tonight. Somebody's tweeted, William, what would you like to see for the future of the didgeridoo? Are you seeing other people doing the same thing with didgeridoos?
Yeah, most definitely. That's what it's about. It's about people, becoming a part of a journey. Don't have to become a follower, but certainly, create your own tone. As a guitarist would, listening to Jimi Hendrix, you find, inspiration in that guitarist style playing, but then you've got to find your own voice, whether that's with, a pick or your fingers on the guitar or the didgeridoo through the voice of, your vocal cords and tongue rhythms. And so, yeah.
And just ending on the idea of the future, Ian, contemporary art, Indigenous contemporary art, where do you see it heading from here? It's already enormously popular. I mean, Indigenous contemporary art is the dominant form of contemporary art in Australia, isn't it?
In Australia, yeah, it has a long way to go. Overseas, although I did read somewhere there are more German didgeridoo players than Australian didgeridoo players, and maybe that was just meant to be a joke, but Indigenous contemporary art has a long way to go in the discourse of contemporary art, in my opinion, the global discourse of contemporary art, because of these preconceptions about Indigenous art. So it can only be up. Mm-hmm. Can only get better.
Well, it's positive. Bindi, your thoughts? And do you feel that as well, as Ian's pointed out, enormously successful in Australia? Do you feel a kind of ceiling, though, when it comes to, say, Europe or overseas, and the way the audiences react there, or galleries?
Yeah, I don't think I'm at that point yet where I've felt that ceiling. Look, I guess I'd like to pay homage to the artists that have gone before me, like artists from places such as Bumali, because I think when they were making contemporary kind of urban Indigenous art, it wasn't the way it is now. There wasn't those opportunities that present themselves. They really fought to make the platform that is there right now. And so if you were talking about this 20 years ago, it'd be a whole other story. And so I'm really grateful to them for forging that way.
And Glenn, just finally, I mean, when you look at the entire art scene in Australia, what do you see in the future for contemporary Indigenous art?
I would like for Indigenous programming and like great exhibitions like this thing not to be the victim of popularity and fashion. I think that Indigenous programming needs to be consistent, and I hope that it becomes something which is done more regularly. I think the Australian public has been given sporadic kind of doses of Indigenous art, and I think that the institutions and governments which manage our kind of art programming should be making it a priority.
No, but do you fear that it might go down that track?
Of being sort of responsive to popularity
That's
contests? Right. I think it is already. And it's great to see shows like this because they don't happen enough, and I would like to see them happen more often.
Well, that's probably a very nice point to end tonight's proceedings on, with a compliment to the My Country exhibition here at GOMA. We are going to have to wrap it up there, but please don't leave as we finish, because William has kindly agreed to perform for us, to take us out tonight. So while he's getting set up over there, I'll just thank our other panellists, artist Bindi Cole, whose work is featured in the My Country exhibition, WA-based curator and artist Glenn Isiger Pilkington, former artist, or that's probably
dormant.
still in the spirit. Musician and composer William Barton, of course, and art historian Ian McLean from the University of Wollongong. So let's give them a round of applause. And just before we throw to our musical act tonight, a reminder that you will be able to view tonight's discussion again simply by going to GOMA's website and following the prompts. Thanks to all of you out here in the audience and who've joined us via webcam tonight for being here with us and also tweeting your questions and your thoughts. I'm Antony Funnell, and on behalf of GOMA and Radio National, thank you very much and bye for now.
This piece is called GOMA, Going Back to My Country. No. It's called Digifusion. It encapsulates a little bit of my journey from Kalkadunga country, Mount Isa.
Get on the Marabai. Got the mountain of Billa, mountain of Iwana. Hey, Billa in town. Billa no feet. Got the mountain of Billa, mountain of Iwana. Hey.
Thank you.
Pretty good, huh?